All right, we are live. Welcome, everybody, to our second Learning Lab conversation for this series that we're calling Why Church? And Why Church, of course, is our series where we're asking the big question, why in an age of disillusionment with Christianity, when so many people are walking away from religious expressions of all kinds, in a time when the single biggest religious demographic in America now are the nones, those who check none on their census form when asked, what religious affiliation are you? In that kind of environment that we're in these days, why is it that we would ask anybody to still be a part of the church? How is it that we really can realistically expect anybody to be a part of a church? So that's sort of the big question. And of course, we are asking a series of questions related to that. This is our second conversation with a panel of church leaders from across the country. And today we're asking the question, what is the future of tradition? So if part of what people are walking away from with Christianity is a sense that there are these traditions that maybe don't seem so relevant to them anymore, then the big question is, what's the future of tradition? Is there a place for tradition in our churches? Is there a way that tradition can still be not only relevant, to use that word, but also genuinely spiritually formative and good? Or should traditions just be sort of tossed out and burned to the ground so that we can start over in a fresh way, so that the church can be reborn in a way that's more meaningful to new generations? So that's really what we're here to talk about today. We'll be here with you for about the next hour having this conversation. And as usual, I've invited a group of panelists to join with me. So I want to take a moment just to introduce all of them. I'm just going to go around my screen as they appear clockwise. So first we have Reverend Brandon Robertson from Mission Gathering San Diego, where he's the lead pastor. Welcome, Brandon. How are you today?
Oh, good. Thanks. It's good to be back with you.
Really good to have you with us. I know that you were just recently on a little bit of a trip to Texas. How was that?
It was good. Who knew that Austin was such a fun city? I had no clue.
Yeah, Austin's an awesome city.
It is.
So I love seeing your pictures, you and Rich, like tooling around the city. That looked like fun.
Totally.
And then next up, we have Cedric Lundy, who is the teaching pastor at Watershed Charlotte in North Carolina, and also street leader director at Urban Promise, a nonprofit in Charlotte, North Carolina. Welcome, Cedric. How are you?
Hey, doing well. Good to be back.
How are things in North Carolina looking for you right now?
We're starting to finally get a little bit of fall weather where there's actually a difference between the evening temp and the during the day temp. So can finally start to bust out the layers
Nice.
in the wardrobe.
Yeah. We don't have that pleasure in San Diego. It's pretty much just one season all year round. So yeah. Also, just to acknowledge that Cedric's East Coast time, so thanks for joining us. It's evening where Cedric is, so we appreciate you carving out time in your evening to join with us today. And then speaking of being a little farther east, we also have with us the Reverend Dr. Jason Coker, the second Jason Coker in this conversation. Jason is the area coordinator for Cooperative Baptist Fellowship in Mississippi, and also the executive director of, the national director, I should say, of Together for Hope, which is a rural development coalition for the cooperative Baptists out there. Great to have you with us, Dr. Coker. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you guys.
It's always a pleasure to have as many Jason Cokers on these calls as I possibly can. And then last but certainly not least, a guest that we've had also before on these conversations along with Brandon and Cedric is Shonda Jha, who is the executive director of the Oakland Peace Center. Welcome, Shonda. How are you today?
It's super fun to be back. Thank you so much for having me again.
Yeah, you're welcome. Shonda mentioned right before we went live that she has the privilege of not being in congregational leadership anymore. So maybe, Shonda, you could tell us a little bit about what is the Oakland Peace Center and how does that connect with your life of faith?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Oakland Peace Center is a collective of 40 different nonprofits that are working to collectively address issues of equity, access, and dignity as the means of creating peace. And what's really beautiful about that vision is that when I was pastoring First Christian Church of Oakland and had just gotten there in 2006, we had a conversation about what they wanted to contribute to their neighborhood. And all of us had the shared experience of having lost people in the streets due to violence. And they didn't have a lot of energy. They didn't have a lot of people. They had a lot of building and a lot of commitment to addressing violence. And so we decided to meet up with the folks in the community who were on the front lines of that work and just ask the simple question of, how can we help? And sometimes that helping was flyering for Silence the Violence Day, or sometimes it was getting our friends to come to the Oakland A's game when they were sponsoring a fundraiser for ending violence in the community, or sometimes it was working the front doors to make sure that the kids at the Turf Unity concert didn't bring weapons in with them. And over the course of those years, we built up relationships with folks. And a few years in, I said to the congregation, you don't have to admit this. I don't think you have the energy to launch the next thing. But I think you've got a lot of space to nest the thing that the folks with the energy are doing. I wonder what would happen if this space became an incubator and a collaborative space for the folks on the front line so that they don't feel as isolated, alone, and prone to burnout in the midst of some of the hardest work we've got ahead of us. And that's how the Oakland Peace Center was born. And the congregation still exists. I am no longer their pastor. The phenomenally gifted Monica Cross is pastoring them, and she serves on our board. And I don't have to pastor at all anymore, and everybody's better for it.
Well, so the reason that I asked you just to take a moment and share that is because one of the things I love about that story is that it is a good example of how a congregation stopped to ask the question, what is the Spirit of God leading us to, right? So it's this future leaning question that challenges all kinds of comfort zones and all kinds of like presuppositions about what church is and what church ought to do. And so I wanted to just sort of make that connection explicit that your experience has all to do with kind of what we're talking about today. What is the future and where's God leading us? And really everybody on this call represents that. Brandon's part of a church that has been asking that question for a long time now, continually, and embodying that. Cedric's part of Watershed in Charlotte, which is really trying to live out a kind of future expression of church now in a very traditional part of the country. And same with Jason Coker, Dr. Coker. He is, of course, in a pretty formal denomination, not unlike the Disciples of Christ, but really trying to lean into sort of future expressions of what the grace and mercy of God looks like in impoverished communities. So I wanted to kind of connect all those dots a little bit as we jump into the conversation. And I'd like to jump into the conversation just by making an observation, telling a quick story. So the first observation is, as you all know, trust in American institutions across the board is at an all-time low for Americans. Right now, trust for sort of the 14 main expressions of so-called trusted institutions in the United States is down around 32% on average right now, according to Pew, which conducts this poll every few years to gauge institutional trust in Americans. So those 14 institutions include everything from the military to banking to, of course, churches, right? And you can imagine that trust in banking institutions is at an all-time low, or that trust in politics, for example, is very, very low. Dismal, actually, down below 9%, according to Pew. But really for churches and religious expressions as well, it's very low, down below 30%, which means Americans by and large do not trust churches or institutions. And I think that distrust in institutions connects to our question about tradition today, because I think traditions are one of the ways that institutions express themselves in people's lives. And so I want to just pause there and tell a quick little story. It's a story of me being on staff as an associate pastor at a big church in Columbus, Ohio, several years ago. And I was the associate pastor. So I was like the approachable pastor on staff, right? Because we were at a big church. There was a senior pastor that nobody got access to, right? Except for like the core elite, you know, like the Peter and John and, you know, James of the church. And then I was the pastor that everybody got to talk to, right? And so one of my jobs was always after church to be in the lobby, just interacting with people. And one day a guy came up to me and we just got to chatting, and he mentioned that he had been a pastor on staff at another church. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting. What are you doing here at our church? He said, well, things changed and I changed careers, and now I'm like, financial advisor. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. Do you like it here? Oh yeah, I love this church. And then he told me all the things that we did as a church that he really loved. He said, but you know what? He said, I just so you know, I mean, I've been at this church for a couple of years now, and my wife and I are involved. We really love it, but I just want you to know, we don't give money to this church. And I said, well, okay. I mean, but why don't you give money to our church? I mean, you said you like it. You said you believe in what we do. Oh yeah, I think that's great. It's just, I really have a heart for the poor all over the world, and so my wife and I, we give our tithe to World Vision, because we think what World Vision does is just, incredible and far more impactful than what this church could ever do. And so I just wanted you to know, we give our tithe to that other organization. And I just walked away from that conversation like, wow, like, here's a person standing in the church lobby who's telling one of the pastors, I don't give money to your church and have no intention of giving money to your church. And essentially the reason why he wasn't giving money to the church was because he didn't trust that we would use that money in a way that was genuinely impactful. As much as he liked us, right? As much as they appreciated what we do. And so that was my first sort of inkling of how institutional distrust in a religious setting can really affect what a church is able to accomplish. So all that to lead up to my first question. I'd love for any of you just to jump in. How have you witnessed that kind of erosion of trust for church as an institution in the work that you do? How do you recognize that erosion of trust in people's words or people's actions? How are you seeing that at play?
Well, I first want to say that the story you just told, the first problem is that you were in Columbus, Ohio. So there's that. As a native of Michigan, I just gotta say, Ann Arbor, Michigan. That's your first mistake. But anyway, I digress. Keep it in the kingdom. Keep it in the kingdom. I would say one of the ways that I've seen a lack of trust start to build within people who call church home, and starting to be even more suspect, is oftentimes how there's something about the story that you told really resonated, how all of the quote elite or executive branch of the pastoral staff were inaccessible. And at a certain point, I was at a church where one by one, over the course of a number of years, the pastors who weren't necessarily on that top level, who were actually the ones that were interacting with people, who were getting involved in the good, bad, and the ugly of people's lives, started to leave. So I just officiated a wedding last week of someone that I haven't been one of the quote pastors of a church that they've been a part of for 4 years, going on 5. But to her and her now husband, I'm her pastor. Mm. And too often, the shepherding and caring for people, I think, is being lost in the way that discipleship has become an industry. Mm. And I think there are many people who are starting to become hip to the game, quite frankly. Mm. So that would be one that I've noticed and heard other people discuss and talk about.
Yeah, and I think, Jason, your story also was super apt, because one of the things I've seen in my 3.5 years now being a pastor at Mission Gathering is there's an initial lack of trust based, and you highlighted this, on people giving money, giving their time, giving themselves to something where there is no tangible impact in the world. And I really wrestled with that for my first year here as a pastor, wondering, what is the incentive? Would I give my money to just fund my own salary and keep the lights on in a building, which is essentially what most churches are funding? And so I've really tried to work over the past few years to figure out how to, one, better utilize resources so that we can have a community that trusts what we're up to. Because if they trust us, then we can actually make an impact. And so, I mean, that's what's leading Mission Gathering in the process right now. We're selling our property here. We're trying to figure out, like, why would we just keep pouring all these tithes and offerings into this old building when our heart is actually to be impacting those experiencing homelessness around San Diego? And since we've started that process, we've seen church growth again, and we've seen commitment again, because people no longer feel like their money is kind of going in a vacuum. And there's good reason to wonder where all the money is going. We have so many examples in American history in particular of mega church pastors and televangelists buying jets and flying around the world. And I don't want my church thinking that I'm taking that money and just going on vacation. They want to see their money actually impacting the world. And I think that is a new kind of institution that we need to start thinking about, one beyond brick and mortar, one beyond hierarchies, one that actually is more of an organism in the world.
So we're talking about loss of trust in the institution of religion and the expression of that locally in churches or maybe other faith communities as well. And what's risen to the surface already is that trust is connected to these traditions like giving money to a church, right? Like that's one of the traditions of Christianity. We've all already used very traditional words to refer to that, like tithes and offerings, for example, right? Like tithes and offerings is literally a phrase that people not raised in church wouldn't understand. Like that's incredibly like traditional language around that. And so the connection between that tradition of giving tithes and offerings to this institution in the church is lost because of that loss of trust, because people want to see an impact out of the giving that they make, is what I hear you saying. Yeah. Anybody else? Any other thoughts on how you've noticed that expression of a loss of trust in the institution of the church?
No, I think we have been in an age of a crisis of meaning, or the lack of meaning production within congregational life, specifically in America. I think Europe, for the most part, is post-Christian for sure. And when you look at the global church, I mean, where church is growing most is in the global South. And so the center of Christianity, by and large part, has shifted to the global South. And we are kind of right at the edge of a post-Christian society in America. And I think that's some of the anger and the angst that happens with people who are wanting to hold on to the past, maybe make America great again slogans, is trying to hold on to something that's being lost, and it is being lost. And for me, if churches can't be in the meaning creation, meaning production business, they should close their doors or find another way to be a part of making meaning in the world. Because I don't know why anybody would go to a church and much give their time if they're not getting anything out of it. And I'm not saying that as a consumer. I'm saying that as somebody who believes that church needs to have some kind of meaning and value. And if it doesn't, one, I wouldn't give money to it. And two, I'd certainly not give my time, which is much more valuable to me.
I feel like something that's kind of coming up implicitly in what everybody's shared, and I've really appreciated it, is I don't know if any of you have read Adrienne Marie Brown's book, Emergent Strategy, but she talks about how if you trust the people, they become trustworthy. And trust is a two-way street. And our institutions have functioned with contempt for us. Not just the church. Part of the reason I'm kind of on the very tail end of Gen X. Part of the reason that we have a reputation for being completely unplugged from institutions is because we were shaped by I wasn't born in the era of Vietnam War, but like the aftermath of it, and the aftermath of Nixon, and I lived through the Reagan administration, which poured huge amounts of contempt on everybody in my community over and over and over. And so we are going to extend trust in the level that it's extended to us. So the church can reflect on that in any way it wants to, in terms of how it values young people, how it values queer folks, how it values people of color, the way that the church votes, because the majority of white mainline Protestants, as well as evangelicals, as well as Catholics, are voting for Donald Trump. And that tells me the level of contempt you have for me as an immigrant, as a queer person, as a woman. And for my Black and brown family. So I'm not saying this on behalf of the congregation or on behalf of its pastor. I just wanted to put that out there, just to acknowledge that I know I'm going out to the left when I say that. What I do want to say though is I've got this. I belong to this scrappy little queer, trans, people of color, lay-led congregation here in Oakland. And I don't give my whole tithes to the congregation, but I give a reasonable amount given my income. They asked me to facilitate a month of conversations about the future of that church recently. And it was stressful, and it was terrifying, and it was, will we make it? Do we have the people? It was horrible work to have to do. I was in a sweat the entire month over it. And while we were in worship that last Sunday, I went into my PayPal account and I changed my tithe. I increased it by 25%. And you know why? It wasn't because they were struggling. It wasn't because I owed it to them. It's because they asked me to play a role. It's because they valued me and trusted me. And that evoked trust from me into them as an institution. And I think that's an important part of this equation as well.
Yeah, I think you bring up an incredibly important point, and I really love that you rooted it in what was happening when we were born as Gen Xers. I'm not quite on the tail end of Gen X, but I appreciate you, like framing it that way. But when we were born, early 70s, the country was coming out of course, this massive cultural upheaval, which feels very familiar right now. With everything that's going on. And part of what was happening at that time, of course, was that the youngest generation that was coming of age then, which were baby boomers at the time, were rising up against some of the values that were being expressed by American institutions. And then their parents' generation really smacked them down, really said, no, we're sorry, you don't get to speak into these institutions. And that created this enormous social rift. And our church here in Oceanside, which has been around since 1875, right? It experienced that moment in American history in the 1960s. And it resulted in the decimation of this church in the 1960s because teenage and young adult baby boomers were just smacked down by the existing leadership here. And overnight, this went from being one of the biggest churches in town that experienced its heyday in the late 50s and early 60s, went from being one of the biggest churches in town to being a very, very small church in just a matter of about 5 years, because that next generation was basically told to shut up and be quiet. And that's what one of the things I hear you saying, Shonda, is that when people are told that they don't get to speak into the institutions that are impacting their lives, of course, they won't trust them anymore, right? And so here we are again, 50 years later, right, facing another massive cultural moment and another generation of Gen Y and Gen Z, because millennials are old now, right? So Gen Y and Gen Z are asking for the opportunity to speak into their own future. And I'm worried that we're trying to say no again, right? And what will that produce in terms of, distrust for the future? So I'm wondering how you guys think this maybe impacts the church's future in terms of its expression of tradition. So, for example, the church utilizes all kinds of traditions in its midst, and we've kind of touched on marriage as one of those already. Marriage is a tradition that is being increasingly rejected by millennials and Gen Y and Gen Z. And so how do we as a church respond when people are rejecting the very traditions that we're offering to them as ways of making meaning, as Jason talked about, right? Like, if the traditions that we have to offer are supposed to be meaningful to people for their flourishing, what future do you see for the church in its ability to offer meaningful traditions in the future?
Can I want to respond to you. I've been reading a lot of Richard Niebuhr lately. Something he wrote in 1937, The Kingdom of God in America, and then something almost 60 years ago, Christ in Culture. And his Christ in Culture still is probably one of the most important books in this moment,
Mm-hmm.
because it talks about how in different parts of Christian history, the Christian tradition was countercultural.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways that was good, in some ways that wasn't, right? And then he talked about how there were times, and so being counterculture, they was saying something to culture, right? This is what you
Mm-hmm.
need to do, what you shouldn't do, that kind of stuff. But then he also talks about Christ in culture.
Mm-hmm.
And in that section, he says culture leads the church. Culture's doing something new, and God is in it. God is
Mm-hmm.
in the culture doing something new, calling the church to follow along. And I think it's very important to recognize that part of Christian tradition, where we would say the culture isn't necessarily Christian per se, but what it's doing is right and good. And the church
Yes.
is in the lag, and we need to catch up. There are a lot of moments, I think, that we need to kind of revisit some of Niebuhr's concepts there, especially now. And marriage, I think, is one of them,
Mm-hmm.
one of many.
What you just said just really resonated, because I'm personally finding more resonance with a lot of people who have completely and utterly been outside of the church all their lives, to like affirming seeing qualities of the divine in someone who's an atheist, much to the chagrin of someone who is an evangelical Christian, and just being like, I don't know what you're expecting from me as in terms of disavowing what I said, but where's the lie? Like, very cliche statement, but where's the lie? If this person leads with affirming people's humanity, and your tradition is leading you to reject, deny, and negotiate the dignity of other people, the very scripture that you are calling me back to tells a different story.
Mm.
But that gets to the whole tradition thing as well.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, and to kind of make an attempt to tie it all together, you guys mentioned what was happening in the 70s and how there's a lot of parallels between then and now. Well, I'm a Star Wars baby. I was born at the end of 77. But what I understand happened around the same time that the boomers were being told no by their parents, being smacked down. You had this Jesus movement also starting, which led to what would be like the modern day evangelical youth ministry movement. So, as a former youth pastor, I was on the tail end of that. The fascinating thing, and sorry, my daughter's wanting to show me her Halloween costume and just totally distracted me. So if you see T'Challa's sister, or what looks like T'Challa's sister, that's my daughter in her Halloween costume. But I digress. You have the irony that now we're in this moment again, where those same people who got smacked down, the main thing that they built was this tradition that is solely rooted in the Word of God. That Richard Rohr talks about how good theology is made up. It's like a tricycle. You have the scriptures, you have the lived experience and tradition. church tradition. And at least in my experience in evangelicalism, it was all about scripture. And scripture was the tire that had the most air in it. And basically, like, lived experience basically was running on nothing. There's no air in that tire at all. And there's just a little bit of air in the tradition tire. So we're at this moment I've observed where we need to start putting air back into those other two tires. And that's just one of many things that needs to happen in order to breathe life into what the future could look like.
So I just want to maybe launch a little bit off of the comments that both of you made, Jason and Cedric, sort of taking off first from Jason's comment about Christ and culture, and Niebuhr's observation that culture sometimes leads, right? And the church needs to learn to catch up. And then Cedric talking about how he sees that really resonates with him because he sees the values of Christ and Christianity and the story. I love that he connected it back to the stories that we find in Scripture. How sometimes we find people more faithfully living out the hope of those stories outside the church, even if they don't know that that's the story they're living out, right? One of the reasons I love that example is because it demonstrates one of the things that I've been reading a lot lately is Hannah Arendt and her whole sort of theory of action. And of course, by action, she means explicitly political action that creates new possibilities for liberation in the world, right? Because her whole frame of reference is fascist Nazi Germany, right? So she's not talking about labor, right? She's not talking about tasks. She's talking about political action for new liberation. And one of the things that she says that's key and essential to that is what she calls collective memory, that communities of people come together and they access collective memory for past liberationist events. And that becomes the fuel that drives them forward for creating a space of appearing where something genuinely new can happen. And so one of the things that I'm hearing both Jason and Cedric talk about is how that space of appearing happens very much the way that Hannah Arendt described it, happens in culture, right? As people come together in like the polis, or you might even say the ecclesia, right? These sort of political gatherings, not political as in partisan, of course, just political as in people gathered for their own well-being, right? Trusted, to go back to Shonda's comment, to make a way for themselves together. So I'm wondering where you're seeing that happen in culture now, right? So where are you seeing a kind of space of appearing happening where new expressions are being birthed for the good of our communities? And how and then, so that's, I guess, my first question, where are you seeing that, right? So maybe asking Cedric and the rest of you to be a little bit more explicit, maybe name names if you're willing to. And then the second half of that question would be, how can the church participate with that in a way that doesn't attempt to colonize it?
So I'll talk so y'all can come up with your examples. I really, so let me start out by saying I have a good buddy, Russ Peterman. He's a pastor in Fort Worth, Texas. And I quote him all the time because maybe 15 years ago, I remember hearing him say, the church of the 21st century is going to have to look more like the church of the first century than of the 20th century. And I'll say that one more time because there's a lot of numbers and it's confusing. The church of the 21st century needs to look a lot more like the church of the first century than like the church of the 20th century. And the reason I hold on to that so closely is I heard you say new expressions, and I think what is inspiring me the most are some pretty ancient expressions. Jason, number 2, you said something about moving into a post-Christian era, and I gotta say, praise Jesus for that, because I think that our religion is so radical And it's so bold and it's so visionary that if it is appealing to a majority of people in a nation, we are not doing it right. And that's why we are connected to this ancient lineage of folks who were on the margins of the margins of the margins, who had contempt heaped upon them because what they envisioned was so ridiculous by the standards of the empire and everybody trying to survive the empire. And so, which is where it is relevant, Cedric, that you are a Star Wars baby, because we were trained up with those movies to think the same way, right? So what I think is important about that is this summer, I've been navigating that balance of it is not from a health, it did not seem from a health perspective to be safe for me and a lot of my colleagues to be in the streets. We did the car caravans for the movement for Black Lives. We did the honking protests in front of the jails to release immigrants who were being kept in unsafe conditions. There's only so far that those modern day things can go. And what we did was we prayed. We spent 12 hours. We convened people from all over the country to pray for 12 solid hours for the young Black leaders in the streets who were leading us, praying for God to pour safety and healing and health and victory over them. And that's nothing new, y'all. That's ancient stuff. Those prayers for victory, those prayers for overcoming, those prayers of solidarity, those are ancient. We also, Cedric, I bet you know the folks at the Good Neighbor movement. They're in your neck of the woods. We partnered with them. So there were some Oakland organizations that were Black-led and some Charlotte organizations that were Black-led, and got together and did a day of national mourning over the violence done to Black lives and to the violence being done to all of us around COVID. And we prayed and we cried and we mourned and we shared testimonies. And that's all ancient stuff. But Jason, number one, to your point, it's political because it always pointed us to what would God have us do? How are we going to be active? How will our prayers have feet? And I think that that's where we get to connect to tradition in some glorious ways, remembering that our tradition is a tradition of oppressed people on the margins.
Yes. So I want to keep this the answers to this question going, but I just want to pause and acknowledge what I heard. So one, you're seeing spaces of appearing, to use Hannah Arendt's phrase, where new things are being birthed in movements like those protest movements that you are witness to. And number two, the way that a church can partner with that without colonizing is to come alongside in solidarity. And one of our traditions for doing that is prayer. Okay, I'm sorry, Cedric, I didn't mean to step on you. I just want to
Yeah, I was just going to say, building off of what you just said, that's one of the things that in all of the attempts to make them into terrorists and make them into cultural Marxists and whatnot, Black Lives Matter, what people are missing is if you actually read through their statement of beliefs without trying to rephrase or reshape what they're saying to be anti-family, what they're actually saying is, let's create a new family where you don't have to be a traditional family in order to be family. Yeah. And that's getting back to, as you said, ancient stuff. Because the reality is that the first at least 150 years of church history, they weren't being invited necessarily to convert. They were being invited into new family because many of these people were being disowned by their own family. And that if you switched from being whatever pagan god that you were following to being a follower of the way, that your ethnicity and your faith were tied into one. They were inextricable. So if you left your religion, you left your family as well.
Mm.
And in some cases, you also lost your ethnicity. So you became completely displaced.
Mm.
And Black Lives Matter has been this movement that from the very beginning, by virtue of the fact that it being started by 3 queer Black women, has been totally and completely inclusive.
Mm.
And they're not coming up with a statement of beliefs that says you have to fit into this nice, neat little box, just like the early church did, which is why the gospeling of Ephesians 2:11 through 14 is totally undervalued, that Christ is breaking down the dividing wall of hostility. Because a lot of the people that were coming into it, they came from different groups that used to be hostile to one another, in particular when you think that it was the Israelites versus everybody. So, yeah, I mean, Black Lives Matter is a really good example of an organization that is creating new family, and last but not least, it's not centralized.
Mm-hmm. So, Cedric, to just maybe reiterate what I just heard. First of all, you see new spaces of appearing, new good things being birthed through Black Lives Matter, just to name that. And number 2, I love that you identify a tradition that they're utilizing that you called being inclusive, right? So they're totally and completely inclusive. So is there a space for churches to partner with what Black Lives Matter is doing without trying to like co-opt it, which I know has been an issue for Black Lives Matter, right? So what is a way for churches to enter into partnering with those kinds of expressions that don't try to co-opt or colonize what's happening?
I think the first thing is they got to be willing to pay the cost. So
there's a great book right now by Robert Jones. He's a friend of mine, so I have to not call him Robbie. But he's a Mississippi guy from Jackson, and his White Too Long is an incredible book that kind of chronicles the Southern Baptist Convention's deep rootedness in slavery, Jim Crow, and established white superiority. And just kind of just the simple acknowledgement of white complicity, in white superiority, and then be anti-racist, but not be the hero of being anti-racist. I mean, that's it's way past time for white people to participate in white anti-racism and dismantling white superiority. I mean, we created it. It should be, we should have a big hand in dismantling it, but not play the hero in it. I mean, that's the worst thing that could have happened, to be white people going, see, we've ended racism. I mean, that would just be the grossest thing to do. And it's, it's already out there, but participating with, I think, and understanding our role with, and that's not just, white people within racism, but the church's role in name the, LGBTQIA movement, how the church has been so devastating there. Name it, repent from it, participate in liberation moving forward. I think that's important at every level for the relevance and meaning for Christianity or the church or our traditions, in the present, much less in the future.
So the participating move that I hear both Cedric and Jason referring to, and Jason used the word towards the end there, I wasn't sure if he was going to, but it's repentance, right? Like this, which is a tradition in Christian circles. Like we're supposed to be good at repenting, right? Like we're supposed to know how to do that. And yet our repenting oftentimes, in my observation, just looks like a kind of symbolic, thinly worded, watered down acknowledgement past mistakes, ambiguous like acknowledgement of past mistakes, rather than like walking through. This is what I hear Cedric referring to when he says like being willing to pay the cost of it, right? Like walking through a genuine process of repentance, which is costly. Is that right? Am I capturing what you're getting at there, Cedric?
Yeah, I mean that's definitely one part of it. Is you really, you know, we had this big discussion with the whole stand back, stand by comment that Trump made to the Proud Boys and people wanting him to denounce white supremacy. It was just fascinating to see even some of the Christian voices, Christian leaders come up and say, oh, we condemn white supremacy. And my response was, well, look, I've been in white evangelicalism since I was 6 years old, and I'm in my early 40s. So like I've heard white Christians condemn white supremacy all my life. But even as someone who was raised in that tradition, only within the last 5 to 7 years have I really fully become aware of how complicit Christianity in the West has been in the project of whiteness and white supremacy. So they're condemning something they don't even really truly understand. So you got to first do the work of actually learning that history and go through that grieving and lamenting and repenting cycle, because the more you learn, the more you're going to end up being right back at grief, being right back at lamenting, and right back at repentance. And not that the whole thing is to make people feel guilty, but the other part of that cost is when you begin to do that, what will eventually happen is there are going to be people who don't appreciate what you're doing, and they're going to kick you out, and then you're going to become displaced. So there's two costs that need to be accounted for. But if anything, hopefully what will eventually happen is as people get displaced, they will find that they're actually being launched and birthed into new family as well.
That's good. I think, Brandon, as we've been talking through this, I've thought about you and Mission Gathering, because a large part of what Mission Gathering has been doing for several years now is advocating for a local population of really vulnerable people. And so I'm wondering, like, what lessons you feel like you guys have learned in walking out in solidarity with homeless youth, or any of the other groups that you guys serve that I may be less familiar with. Yeah,
this is such an interesting direction for the tradition conversation. I really appreciate it. Because I think hearing this just reminds me that the Christian tradition is less about a religious tradition and more about a social and a political tradition, which has been said here a lot. And our tradition, my understanding of the gospel and the movement Jesus started was that he was preaching primarily a socio-political message with spiritual implications that could be incarnated into any religious tradition. All the early Christians remained Jewish, and they continued to follow Jesus in their tradition. And then Paul allowed many, we see it all throughout the New Testament, this wrestling with pagan identity and whether they can keep doing pagan traditional things while also following Jesus. I think at Mission Gathering, we've really tried to set aside in some ways all the religious aspects of what people are looking for in a church, because frankly, people are finding it in better quality in different places all around the world right now. You can go to Soul Cycle and have a better experience than listening to me preach on Sunday morning. But what people do need is, I often talk about not organized religion, but religion for organizing, right? They need a space, an institution to be able to say, hey, it's my job throughout the week to make connections and cultivate a space so that we can come together as a community and actually use our resources, use our time in an effective way to bring about and create that new beloved community, that family that we're talking about. And so for us, we've been doing that with those experiencing homelessness. And that has led us, very much like the early church, to fight the powers that be. We've been in a lawsuit against the city for 1.5 years now. And I feel like just watching our church, which I honestly felt like 2 years ago was kind of stagnant, then we had this opportunity to step in and actually utilize our Christian faith in a way that was making an impact. And I saw a revitalization. People wanted to be a part of a community that was actually speaking truth to power and fighting the powers that be on behalf of those on the margins, which is, again, precisely why Jesus found himself crucified, because he was willing to speak truth to the power and was willing to fight for those on the margins. And that is what the early church was doing in the early Roman Empire. So yeah, I just think it's just a reminder that our tradition is, in some sense, to forget about tradition and to look at our culture and say what is needed right now and how can we organize ourselves in a way that's actually helpful, rather than how can we get together and do a bunch of religious rituals and kind of be intellectually stimulated, which is what so much of Christianity has become.
Am I allowed to push back or ask a clarifying question?
Yes.
You're allowed to do whatever you want, Shonda.
That's not usually what people say, so thank you. So I think this is an interesting question because, and y'all will have to forgive me, my next book is on how connecting with the spiritual and cultural practices of our ancestors equips us for the work of dismantling white supremacy. So I actually have a stake in the tradition, in the how it's been done. And so I'm curious, Brandon. I was nodding my head to everything you said until you got to the throwaway tradition, and I was like, I don't know if that puts us in a position of being very groundless. And I might be saying that partly as a person of color. Knowing who my people are is how I survive. Now, my people are not uncomplicated, don't get me wrong, but knowing the legacy that I'm connected with, having wisdom from those who came before, and not just like my biological ancestors, not even just my ancestors in the freedom movement in India, my spiritual ancestors. There is something about the fact that in the midst of this work that feels terrifying and like no one's ever been through it before, to be able to turn to the Psalms and been like, oh, someone's been through this before and they made it through, means something to me. So I wonder, on the one hand, I loved everything you said, and then on the other hand, I was like, whoa. So help me figure that out, because you're actually, for those of you who don't know Brandon's way smarter than I am.
No, first of all. Second of all, I absolutely agree with you. I think my challenge, my pushback to the church is, well, for me, I'll speak for me personally, that I don't find that my inherited Christian tradition has actually become more harmful than helpful to many people in my community. And I actually have found, and I was going to say this earlier, I've found that there's been this strange movement that I was uncomfortable with at first and then found myself a part of, to say, let's move beyond our Christian tradition, which only goes back 2,000 years, really 500 years for most modern expressions of Christianity. Let's look at the indigenous traditions of where we come from, whether that, I was at Union Seminary last year, part of a young millennials program, and listening to Black clergy talk about how rerouting themselves in their African indigenous traditions was so revitalizing to their faith, and yet so demonized by the church. Even the modern liberal church has no space for some of what might be considered pagan practices. And even for me, I in a non-COVID world, go to Ireland about 4 times a year. I have been going because I find a deep resonance with the pagan spirituality of my ancestors 4,000 years ago. In some senses, that was deeply connected to the earth, that I feel like Christianity has colonized and hijacked all of these indigenous narratives and then demonized them. So I think when I talk about tradition, I want to free people up in our community to say, you should explore and experiment and not think that Christianity and or Jewish traditions that we sometimes rely on are the only way. In fact, I want to encourage you to go even deeper, because I feel exactly what you were saying, that especially millennials, I feel like we're a rootless generation. We didn't grow up hearing stories from our parents. We didn't grow up deeply rooted in any religious tradition. We need a story. We need a community. We need an ancestry to ground ourselves. I think I want it to go beyond Christianity, although I think Christianity is still helpful for so many people in many ways. So anyways.
I mean, I feel like we're coming full circle to the conversation about whiteness, because this is, of course, one of the problems with whiteness, is that it erases the ethnic identity of people who are deemed white. And so when I hear you talking about like resonating with your ethnic history, because I could share that same experience. My ethnic history is largely, English, German, Irish, right? And so there's something lost for American people who were told that this is a melting pot, right? And then you sort of fall under the heading of being white, and that violence is done to everybody, right? Like, to be white is not just to be the oppressor, it's also to be somebody who's been robbed of a very powerful access to ethnic identity in your own right. So not to like recenter white people in that conversation at all, but just to acknowledge that, the violence is violence being done across the board to everybody who's involved.
I want to just add to that. There's a great race theorist, Van Dyke, I don't know if I pronounce her name right, but she wrote a book called Learning to Be White. And she always asked her white colleagues in the academy, when did you learn that you were white? And they were like, after the first dismissal, when they started thinking about it, they would always come back to her and tell her a traumatic experience. Whereas kid, they met somebody else who wasn't white and started playing, and their parents was like, you can't do that anymore. Or they started dating somebody and they're like, you can't date them anymore. So even learning to be white is a kind of self-denial of humanity. And that is a real thing. I mean, so whiteness and white is racist. And even from the origins of race in America. So there is a violence there.
So thank you for adding that. I really appreciate that. I want to tap into something that Brandon started scratching at, though, and I think speaks to a little back and forth Brandon and Shonda were having. And that is, I think that part of this begins to uncover that there is a real human desire and human need for rooted rituals. And just to make the observation that Christian rituals are all derived from Jewish rituals for the most part, and that those Jewish rituals are themselves derived from the ethnic communities that they visited and were in and among and around. And so like all of these things that we're talking about have like deep cultural interconnected webs, right? So whatever rituals we're talking about, they're derived from some other form or ritual. I'd like to maybe, just as we close, shift the conversation to ritual and just sort of ask that question: what kinds of rituals can the church move forward with? Or maybe the flip side of that is, what kinds of rituals are you seeing being birthed? And I'll just sort of frame that two ways, and you're welcome to just access it in whatever way makes sense to you. Number one, we're Disciples of Christ Church. There are 3 Disciples of Christ people on this call. So a little bit of a DOC love fest going on here, I know. But one of the distinctive practices of the DOC is we practice communion every time we gather. So communion is literally the ritual that's at the center of every single gathering. Even though in our church, our gathering has become very informal, that's like the most formal part of it. And we practice it very informally, right? So informally, in fact, that after COVID, something really fascinating has happened to our communion ritual. And that is, right when COVID started, we decided to do online church like, most churches did. And we pre-recorded our service like a lot of churches do. And of course, at the beginning of the lockdown, people couldn't like leave their homes and go to the store and buy like grape juice or wine and like communion bread. And we were all avoiding each other. And so for the first like 4 to 6 weeks of our online church gathering together, people were literally leading communion with whatever they had in their homes that resembled like, bread and wine, right? Well, by like the 6th or 7th week, we had somebody leading communion pre-recorded on our church service saying, hey, welcome to communion, everybody. This is something we practice every time we gather. Today, I'm leading communion with kombucha and an almond because because like that was like the closest thing they had to like the body and the blood of Christ. So a really fascinating thing happened for us. I noticed this like bonding happening amongst certain people in our congregation around the extraordinarily non-traditional communion elements that we were using every week. And then I also noticed, because we have some traditional folks in our church too, they were really uncomfortable with that. Like they were like having an allergic reaction to the kombucha almond like communion moment. And so what I noticed about that was that there was almost like it was the nuts. That's right. It was almost like a new derivative ritual was being birthed in our midst that created a sense of solidarity around this crazy anxiety everybody was experiencing with COVID. And I was like, oh, how cool that communion is being like birthed in a kind of new way in our church, right? And so to me, that sort of example stands as this really interesting example of how rituals can evolve and morph and change to meet people's actual experiences. And so I tell that story just to sort of segue into our final sort of segment, which is, what kinds of rituals are you seeing being birthed or taking shape? And maybe it's like my example where it's a pretty traditional ritual, but that's taking new form to provide meaning. Or maybe like, just to give Brandon like an opportunity here, maybe it's like utterly foreign rituals to Christianity that are being imported to provide meaning for a Christian community. So I'm wondering who might want to speak to either of those.
So I'll jump in real quick and get mine out of the way so I can hear from other folks. I am really grateful for the work I get to do alongside workers who are fighting for their rights. And that's a lot of my work in the community. And I've been really grateful when there have been exhausting, arduous, abusive labor struggles where the workers are showing up 5 days a week for years to try to get an organization to take them seriously. And in the midst of that, if the spiritual community recognizes and honors the value of their work, I have been really moved by the foot washing ceremonies I've gotten to be a part of. Because when you are walking that picket line every day, for people of faith to show up and say that walking is sacred is pretty important. So I've been really grateful for the ways that has shown up, because it also means that we're recognizing the wholeness of the people we're showing up in solidarity with, right? I'm not just showing up for the movement for Black lives because you're a Black person. I'm showing up in solidarity with you as a person on a spiritual journey like me. I don't want people just showing up for me because I'm an immigrant. I want them showing up for all of who I am. And I've been moved by the fact that when we've been doing that kind of solidarity work as people of faith with people in the labor movement, with workers, they are also spiritual people. They know what those rituals mean. And I think that's why actually carrying on those ancient practices matters, because it does connect us to a legacy. And it does give us dignity that something brand new can't in the same way. That doesn't mean I'm saying we all need to use the Hawaiian bread and the grape juice every Sunday. But I think there is something about being connected to the ancestors and having work that is derided by the culture, be honored by the people we're connected with through our faith, is profound. That's one tiny example I've been really grateful for.
The work we do in rural America has been accentuated and magnified with COVID. So just food has been most of our organizations have shifted to food delivery. and the food mechanism, the supply chain. I never thought I'd have to learn about supply chain of point A to point B and, getting food to somebody's table. But if I've been a part of leading communion, I've never been a part of leading communion like this. And that food delivery is literally the Lord's Supper. I mean, we get dairy boxes in, and so people get milk. We get meat boxes in, so people get meat. Family food boxes, grab and go lunches for kids. Thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people need food right now. And I told our VP for the Delta, I said, it is a privilege to get to do this. And it is a shame against God that we have to, living in a country like this. So it like helped me, it made me rethink Lord's Supper, not in terms of a religious, service type thing, as much as a kind of daily bread type experience. So that's how I think about the Lord's Supper now in a real different way. The other one that I hope we never lose is I was hiking the Appalachian Trail and was on a mountain in Connecticut and sleeping, and a thunderstorm came in. And it started raining, and it was just me and a tent on top of a mountain, and it would thunder, and the ground would shake up under me, and lightning was striking. And I was just waiting for something. I was waiting to die, right? And as I was waiting to die, the only thing that came into my mind was, trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not into your own understandings, in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your path. It was this like proverb that I had memorized when I was 5 or 6 years old. That part of our tradition, the tradition that revisits us in like moments of mortality, I think that's wildly important. And I would want us to hold on to traditions that mean something to us at the point of death, right? So I think there's something there, and not just Christian tradition, but all religious tradition. We have provisional answers in those moments.
Yeah.
I'm just so prayer. That is a ritual and tradition that we've had for a long time and transcends, all different religious practices, faith communities. But again, it was raised in a faith community, and it's fascinating because I work with a group of teenagers 5 days a week, and whenever some of them are asked to pray, even though they're not necessarily wanting to pray, they'll say, okay, all y'all close your eyes, bow your head. And it's been there that I've realized that somewhere along the way, I started to not bow my head and close my eyes. But it was very intentional. Why? I can't remember when I did it, but I know why. I just remember reading something about how the rabbis used to pray with their eyes open because they wanted to see the thing that they were praying for. And what it's helped me to remember is that my faith isn't just a spiritual faith. It is a faith that desires for the kingdom to come and the will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. So when I'm closing my eyes and bowing my head, it's almost this posture of I'm trying to leave the very place or escape for a moment the very place that I'm asking for God to show up. And so I'm sure I'm not the only one that does this, but I would encourage people to try to start praying with their eyes open and see the very person in front of them sometimes that they're praying for, and see the world that they want to see transformed. Do not avert your eyes.
I love that. And I think for me, the two traditions I hope we hold on to. One, for me, corporate singing, which is something I don't think we'll be able to do for a long time, is powerful. It's been so powerful for people in moments of great injustice. There's just something psychological, but something deeply spiritual that happens in those moments that I feel like is so healing. But then it's already been mentioned. I think in my own life, we Protestants don't honor saints very well, but I think creating modern saints, creating new saints, getting in touch with our ancestry and ancestors and understanding the flaws and the failures, the generational curses and the blessings and the bravery is something that I have been trying to do more and more over the past 5 years, to root myself, one, in a long line of people and knowing that I'm not in this alone and that people have gone through stuff and gotten to the other side. But then there's just something about, as our own scriptures talk about, that great cloud of witnesses, that sense of presence of people who have gone before, who have endured, who have made it through. I find so much peace and solace in that and inspiration in that. And I just really hope that for my Protestant family, as we have so much resistance to anything that looks Catholic or whatever, however we say that, I feel like if we could reclaim that connection to ancestry and to people that we can look up to and admire and even call on, I think there's so much power there.
It's also good. One of the things that's come up a couple times in this conversation today is a prayer, number one, and then kind of an overlapping concept, which is connecting to the traditions or rituals, or like I might say, incantations of other traditions outside Christianity. And one of the fascinating observations that I've sort of been captured by is that for people who are sort of the next generation beneath me, right? I'm an Xer like Shonda. So for millennials and younger, there is this really strong lure towards the concept of like incantations and spells. And because I was raised evangelical, right? Like even using the word spells feels like I'm using a profane word. And yet, I think it was Shonda brought up Adrienne Marie Brown, whose writing I've found to be just incredibly inspiring. And so one of the things that she wrote that I just love, that I come back to a lot, is she calls a radical gratitude spell. So I don't know if you've seen this, Shonda, but I'd like to just read it kind of as we close, if that's okay. She writes, this is on our website, which is adriennemariebrown.net. It's a spell to cast upon meeting a stranger, comrade, or friend working for social and or environmental justice and liberation. And this is the spell. You are a miracle walking. I greet you with wonder. In a world which seeks to own your joy and your imagination, you have chosen to be free every day as a practice. I can never know the struggles you went through to get here, but I know you have swum upstream, and at times it has been lonely. I want you to know I honor the choices you made in solitude, and I honor the work that you have done to belong. I honor your commitment to that which is larger than yourself and your journey to love the particular container of life that is you. You are enough. Your work is enough. You are needed. Your work is sacred. You are here, and I am grateful. So, like, that is maybe one of the most Christian things I've ever read. Right? I mean, there is so much deeply prophetic Jewish and Christian theology in that spell. And I'm fascinated by the lure that people have towards what I would almost call like modern litanies that give meaning to hard and difficult social work. And that kind of theme has come up a lot in this conversation, that if there's a place for the church or for Christian traditions or for Christian rituals in the world right now, it's to provide these spaces where we can express solidarity with the work that the Spirit is doing in culture. And so I'm like, when I think about that, I get very excited about the possibilities, because, Adrienne Marie Brown's example is, to me, an indication that the culture around us is very open to these ritualistic expressions that provide comfort and solace and meaning in a really difficult space of struggle, which is what rituals are supposed to do, right? They're supposed to provide a place of safety for transformation in the midst of liminality, right? Like that chaos that happens in that liminal space between one expression of being and the next. Like, what if the church could provide those spaces of appearing, provide those litanies of meaning and comfort for people who are really transforming the world for the better around us? So, I get excited when I talk to folks like you about what that's looking like in different sorts of expressions. I don't want to keep you guys any longer. Any final thoughts or comments or questions that you want to leave us with as we close this up today?
I just want to invite us in the church into the tradition of humility. That means if folks don't want us there, they get to make that choice, and we don't get to be butthurt about it.
Yes, thank you. All right. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for showing up. Shonda Jaw, thanks for joining us again. This is the second time we've had you. It's always a pleasure. Jason Coker, first time I've had you on one of these conversations, but always fun to connect with you. We appreciate your insight. Brandon Robertson, thanks for joining us again. Welcome back to San Diego. Cedric Lundy, we appreciate you taking the time all the way from the East Coast. Looking forward to having this conversation again. I know a few of you are joining me for another one of these in the coming weeks, and so I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much, everybody.